My dad and I were coming back from a family reunion in Tennessee, and we decided to go to some places that had made him the happiest as a child. Seeing as how our family had moved from that area before, he was far old enough to really remember them. We arrived at one specific location, and we noticed a famous stream that he would always talk about as a kid that he loved to go and fish at, play, and just be a kid had been replaced by a small highway. So we drove around a little while longer, searching for other areas. We found another good one, a little place that he liked to hang out as a teenager. This area was now full of discarded cans and garbage. It wasn't all that great. As we're kind of looking around this area, further back, there were trails that he would usually hike down, and being a teenager, was full of debauchery. He's motioning for me to continue down this trail that led just a little bit deeper into the woods. Now, keep in mind, at this point, a lot of the surrounding wilderness had been turned to highway, and much of the surrounding swamps were now being used for development, not like they were back in the 80s. Now, the surrounding woods we were entering were very thick, very dense. It even kind of cut off light the further in you went. And, I don't know exactly what it was at first. I guess I kind of just got a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Not anything specific, like what you tell in your stories where people get the feeling that they were being watched. Nothing like that. It was more just a gut instinct, like it's probably not safe to continue on further. In that moment, I assumed it was maybe because there might be dangerous homeless people around, or drug addicts, or what have you, since there did seem to be signs of homeless camps, what with all the garbage and cans and stuff, or worse. Now, out of the blue, my father stops dead in his tracks, sticks out his arm as if to stop me from walking further, and I look up at him, and he's staring right at something, and he has the most serious expression on his face. So I'm asking him, "Dad, what do you see? What's up?" And I look out to where he's looking. Well, directly in front of us was kind of this little marsh, I guess you can call it. There was a cement wall on the other side that led to a lone road. Well, on this concrete block, or concrete wall, I guess you can call it, was a medium-sized storm drain. And out of the storm drain was climbing this, what I'll describe to you as a lizard man. I feel silly for even typing that, but that's the only way how I know how to describe it. I mean, imagine a person in a lizard costume or something. Except the movements were so smooth that there's no way this would be somebody in a costume. All the way out here, it didn't really make any sense. We weren't exactly miles and miles out from town, but we also weren't in the middle of a metropolitan area either. And who in their right mind would be climbing out of a storm drain in that sort of costume? We saw it kind of climb its way out and climb down into the marsh. Luckily, we were kind of tucked away back in the trees enough where this creature or animal did not seem to notice us, but my father and I got a very good look at it. Honestly, it kind of reminded me of like a half-man, half-dinosaur sort of thing. The head was very much so reptilian-like. The body was covered in scales, and it had a man very much like a body. 2 arms, a chest, body, legs, all that stuff. Which is why I made the lizard man costume reference a paragraph ago. Once it climbed down out of the storm drain, it began walking off in the opposite direction, into the thick tree line where there's more dense, thicker swamps. It never turned to look in our direction, and never seemed to have noticed us. My dad, of course, his gaze was locked on this thing for the whole 20-30 seconds that we watched it disappear. I think him and I were in such shock and awe, but more so him. I kind of couldn't believe my eyes, but he seemed to have this look on his face that just screamed danger. After this thing disappeared into the thicket of the trees, he finally broke his gaze and looked at me and just said, "We should leave, now." I wasn't going to challenge that. I didn't ask any questions, so we quickly headed on back up the trail, maybe no more than a half a mile, up to the original spot that had all those discarded cans and garbage, made our way back further, and got to the car. After some time, I was the one to finally break the silence and ask, "Dad, what did we see out there? I mean, we both saw it, right? Is that some sort of unidentified animal or maybe undiscovered species?" He remained quiet and just looked at me with a very cold stare and said, "I don't know, son, but I didn't like it." I mean, I know it's a very anticlimactic ending to my encounter, but that's really all that was said. And my father and I have not talked about it since. I mean, I don't really see much of a reason to, but I thought in recent events with the world, I would maybe try and find some time, now that I had off, to reach out to different paranormal investigators and even story narrators, which is why I'm kind of drawn to your work and your channel. So I thought I would shoot you an email. And hey, worst comes to worst, I don't get a response. And best comes to best, you read my story and your audience can help me out, since it appears they've helped out so many others. Best of luck and thank you so much. It was at nighttime, and I was driving along Highway 24, right around the area of this old mill house. This is when I stopped at a stop sign, and I see something large coming out of the tall field grass. At first, I assumed it was maybe a deer, but then I saw it was clearly no deer. The creature I saw, well, I can't identify it. I can tell you this though. It was a behemoth of a thing. Maybe 800 pounds, and I'm not exaggerating. And its body was large and very serpentine-like, or snake-like, I should say. The head alone was maybe 2 or 3 feet large. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. This thing was massive. And it just seemed to kind of rise up out of the grass so calmly. It got about 10 feet away from my car and just glanced on by, as if me being there wasn't a big deal at all. In fact, it really didn't pay any attention to me. Like, it could have cared less that I even saw this thing. And as you can imagine, seeing something like this for the first time, especially at night, feeling extremely vulnerable, having no weapons, nothing, I was terrified out of my mind. This giant human reptile thing walking around with 2 red eyes. Part of me wanted to just stick in my disbelief. This creature checked off every box in a horror movie cliche. But at the same time, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Its gait, its movement. You could see its muscles and skin. I mean, either this was somebody in the most convincing Hollywood monster costume I have ever seen and that's ever been made, or this was something truly out of this world. What's your opinion? This story takes place back in 2014. I was in a 2-story house with my brother, kind of out in the backwoods of Missouri. He and his band rented this house out collectively for rehearsal. It wasn't an out of town too far, but you had to drive maybe about 10-15 minutes to get to it. And being a good brother that he is, allowed me to stay in the upper 2-story part, which is just one big open room, which I used for my bedroom for a couple of weeks after getting out of a very toxic relationship. So, very early on in the morning, I'd say 3 or 4, I was having trouble sleeping, and I'm out there on the balcony looking down just at the woods and the surrounding area, lost in thought. And I suddenly see a huge, maybe 6-7 foot tall dark figure darting across the tree line. It caught my attention, and I thought it was an animal at first, until I looked. That's when I could see the figure much more clearly, because it moved. What I was looking at was a large bipedal animal, and believe it or not, it kind of resembled a cross between a gorilla, a lizard, and a human. Although I couldn't see every enunciation of detail. It was very dark in color. Not just its coloring, but the lighting as well. Its head was huge. It had big long arms, and its body was also large too. The head, though, was more elongated, and, like I stated, easily 6 to 7 feet tall. The only reason that I even saw this thing was because it was a full moon that night, but where the moon was positioned and angled in the sky did not, unfortunately, light up this thing so I can get a look at it. It was in fact on the other area of the sky, giving just enough light that I could see something was here, but not all the details that I wanted. I know it might sound kind of morbid, but I was kind of wanting to see what this thing looked like, only because it was so unique, I guess. It stood there in the tree line for maybe, 10-15 seconds, and then it kind of disappeared deeper into the woods. I was the only person at the house at the time, and I actually wasn't that creeped out. While it was slightly disturbing, I kind of just wrote it off as maybe the darkness playing tricks in my eyes. Maybe the stress and emotional baggage from the bad relationship was causing me to see things that weren't exactly there. I slept on it, and after getting up the next morning, I realized last night was indeed not just stress, but I actually saw something. I've always been a believer in monsters and animals we might not be able to explain, and I've even seen some strange things in my life. But this, my friend, was definitely the strangest I had hands down ever seen. I was on this big adventurous hike to a lake with my friends. We had to walk through at least a couple of miles of woods from where we parked to get to said lake. And for the sake of the story, I'm going to keep the name of the lake anonymous, but I can tell you that it was a very popular lake. Still is. And since I was leading me and my few friends, I was of course in front. And as we're walking through the woods to get to said lake, I noticed something weird. I saw this big shadow, and I looked at it, trying to figure out what it was. I noticed it was kind of watching us from in between some trees, and it stayed perfectly still, so that's why I didn't exactly catch it at first. My first inkling was that it was maybe a man, but the more I looked at it, even with how dark it was, it looked wrong. Now, before I go on, you might be thinking, oh, well, you just saw Bigfoot. But I'm telling you, Bigfoots don't look like this thing did. This had a much more reptile-like appearance. The head was very long. The arms were very long. It kind of reminded me of a serpent head on a human body, with scales and everything, but just dark. After looking at it, I stopped my friends and had them look too, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. As soon as we all stopped and began gawking at this thing, it immediately tilts its head up to look at us and starts jolting after us. We all start screaming and began running back the way we came. We could hear it chasing after us in the woods, and it caught up very quickly. I mean, it was probably no more than 30 yards away at max, and it was in a section of woods where it wasn't so thick we couldn't see it. It's like it was waiting there for somebody, for us. The thing chased after us though, and it was moving so fast, I didn't think it was possible. We didn't know what to do, so we ran and we ran, and we were able to ran back to where we had initially parked. I was so scared. I mean, all of us were. We were all looking at each other like, did that just happen? What was that? I'm not sure why, but I believe whatever this thing was could have caught up to us and grabbed us. But it didn't. It's like it wanted to chase us out for whatever reason. We were only maybe a half mile in the trail, and we all said that we could all hear it almost right behind us, right in the trees. I'm not sure why it never reached out and tried to grab any of us. That's kind of a mystery to me. So we all get in the car and we drive off, and we're trying to speculate what it was. What animal could it have been? A few of us talked and argued that it was a Bigfoot, but Bigfoots don't look like that. Not that I'm aware of, at least, unless I'm missing something. Yes, we were all terrified, but I strongly feel that this was something else entirely. I don't know if lizard men exist or snake men exist, but that's the closest thing I could even compare it to. It was my son and I, and a friend. We were out trout fishing at a local lake, not too far away from home base. It was a late summer evening, around maybe 9:30, just enough to where it was getting pretty dusky, but not quite dark yet. We were all sitting at the end of a dock fishing, and we had our dog, Jody, with us. He's a sweet boy, a Labrador retriever. We take him on all of our outings. At least we like to think he keeps us safe. He barks whenever there's a predator around, so he does a pretty good job of warning us and warding off any potential danger. And thanks to him, with this encounter, we saw what we did and potentially saved our lives. We're sitting there with our lines in the water, lost in conversation, and we hear Jody start barking and barking at something. I turn my attention, and I see he's barking at the water off to our left. Then, I look a little closer, and I see the shape of something large coming up out of the lake. I motion to my friend and my son, and they all look in unison, and we're watching as Jody now begins to bark frantically, going crazy. And then, out of the lake, steps this horror. I don't even know how to describe it accurately in detail. It kind of reminded me of a half-man, half-alligator. Really ugly and grotesque looking, covered in scales and that thick armor plate that alligators are known for having. It just kind of ascends up out of the water. This elongated face. It turns and looks at us, stares at Jody, and casually walks off into the thicket that's right there, maybe no more than 10 feet from the water. As soon as it fully ascends out of the water and onto the shore, Jody begins whimpering and running back towards us, as he's terrified of whatever creature that is. My son, nearly soiling himself, was screaming, "Dad, Dad, what is that? What did we just see?" And my friend, of course, was silent, as was I. We couldn't really say much, but we all three agreed in unison, "Let's leave." I just didn't feel it was safe there anymore. On the drive back, we all kind of talked about it a little more and said, "Man, I don't know what that thing was, but as soon as we saw it, this feeling of we should leave now, it's not safe, just kind of took over all of us. I mean, had it not, I don't think we would have left. Something was wrong. What that something was, I don't know. Look, I'm not an advocate for the strange and paranormal. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that, or even Bigfoot or strange creatures. But I can't explain this animal. I don't want to go so far as to say it was a lake monster. I feel like that's ridiculous, but I've never seen a reptilian that was bipedal, that also came out of the lake. That was a first for all of us." Let me just say this first and foremost. I'm not a conspiracy person. I don't own a tinfoil hat, metaphorically of course, and I'm a pretty rational, scientific-rooted person. But I have no way to explain away this experience that I had back in 1998. Let me tell you, I was just a sophomore in college, and I was working in a bar in a small town in southwestern Florida. It was a great place, frequented by locals, many of whom I knew and many of whom knew me. We had a lot of regular faces. It was a place where people could get beer and never have to worry about somebody making them feel uncomfortable or getting hit on or getting in a fight. At least, not while on my shifts. It was a fun place. At the time, I was the only girl working there. I was the bartender and the only female that served beer. So, I was the only female that had to work at the bar. The place was a small old building that had originally been a gas station, and years later was converted to the store, and then eventually became a bar. The bar was in the front, and the back of the building held the kitchen, a small office, and the bathrooms. So, enough about that. It was a Saturday night. I was working the bar all by myself, which I was accustomed to. I had worked by myself quite a bit, and I'm not gonna lie, I have never made as great as tips as I ever have in my life working that job. But tonight was pretty slow. The place only had a few customers, and I was chatting with a group of maybe 3 people who were sitting there at the bar. Just small talk, just joking around and having fun. I thought I was having a pretty good time until this particular man walked in. He walks up right to the bar and I turn around, cleaning a bar mug. I did not know this man. I'd never seen him before, but there was something interesting about what he wore and the way he looked. I did not know anybody else who knew him. In fact, I wasn't the only one startled by his presence. Everybody in that bar seemed to kind of have that Hollywood movie moment where the guy walks in and where everybody just stops and kind of stares with a blank expression. That's the perfect way to kind of captivate this moment. He sits down, never breaking a stare. I mean, he's a big guy, strong jawline, dark hair. He had a black shirt on and jeans and looked like he had just come from the gym. The thing that struck me the most, though, was his eyes. They were these incredibly dark eyes. Not like fully black or anything, but he just had really stark, contrasty eyes. They were almost hypnotizing, and not in a lustful, romantic way. It was almost like a trance, like he had this power. I know, it's a bizarre description, but that's what it was. He had this very intense look on his face, almost like he was waiting for somebody, me, to say something. So I kind of stood there without a word, just staring back at him, wondering who this guy was. After a little bit, maybe 10 seconds, I nervously just said, "Can I help you?" without him ever breaking his gaze. He just kept stare, smirked a little, and just said, "I think so." Now at this point, I was getting creeped out. His demeanor, his attitude, everything was just weird. I mean, I've worked here already for a while, and no guy has ever just came in here and looked at me like that, without saying anything. I didn't know what he wanted, and I did not know who he was. So, my response was, okay, what do you want?" He paused for a moment. Keep in mind, during this entire interaction, I don't even think I saw the man blink once, let alone break eye contact. It was the creepiest thing. He calmly just says, "I want you," in a very monotone. At this point, not only am I creeped out, but I'm confused. And in the moment and being nervous, I was like, I'm working, what do you want?" He smirked again and said, "I would like to buy you a drink, if you want one." I had to politely kind of shoot him down and say, "Well, I'm working, so I don't drink right now. But maybe if you stick around, you can buy me one later." So he said, "Okay." And he just sat there, looking at the menu. And so now I'm kicking myself for even saying that. Stupid. Why did I give him such an invitation? Oh gosh, I was a nervous wreck. The people sitting at the bar just kept staring back at me, staring back at him, staring at each other, exchanging glances of confusement and, "Oh boy, she's in trouble" kind of look. He sat there quiet, and I was busy cleaning and doing my job duties. Maybe 45 minutes goes by and he's still sitting there, staring at the menu. I think I asked him, "Have you thought about what you wanted yet?" And as he turns to look back up at me, here's the terrifying part. As he lifts his head up in response to my question, his eyes were not normal. There was something wrong with them. They looked like snake eyes or something. They were this dark green and had these huge black slits in them. And maybe like a half second later, no more than a second, it's almost like they turned normal again. Like the same way an alligator does. You know, how they have those secondary eyelids. It was like a blinking, but not with his actual eyelids. I kind of screamed when I saw it, and kind of flung myself back. He did that blinking thing and his eyes were normal again, just very dark. And he looked puzzled, but still very mono-expressive. Tilted his head very robotically and asked, "What's wrong?" I told him, "You need to get out of here now or I'm calling the police." Then, without ever breaking eye contact, he slowly stands up, then turns his head and his body, and slowly goes to walk out the door. As he gets to the door, he stops as his hand touches the door, turns around, looks at me again, and says, "It's a shame. You would have made such a great addition." Then immediately turned around and walked out. That was the last I ever saw of him. My skin felt like it was crawling. I was so creeped out. The guys at the bar were like, "Who was that guy?" And I told them, "I don't know." Luckily, my regulars were very kind and nice to me and said, "Hey, we don't know who he was, but we all got the creeps. We'll stay here late if you'd like to use clothes to protect you." I thought that was very kind, and I took all 3 guys up on the offer. And they stayed with me until my shift ended at around 1 or 2 in the morning, kept me company. The guy never reappeared. So that's my college story. Now, here's an important note. Fast forward almost 10 years to about 2009, and my aunt is very big, still is by the way, into the paranormal and things like conspiracy theories, reptilians, all that kind of stuff. Nothing that I really ever pay attention to. But I guess she was telling me there are these beings called reptilians. They apparently have the ability to shapeshift into people. I kind of laughed the notion off at first, and then she went on to show me some clips. People being caught on camera, like newscasters and TV hosts and celebrities, except their eyes change, and she showed me that. I felt my skin crawl again. That memory of that night instantly came back to me. That's exactly what I saw that night. I didn't tell my aunt anything. I mean, I always thought she was kind of crazy, but I just kind of shot her down and was like, "Yeah, that's terrifying." But I knew deep down, something was wrong with that man. I can't sit here and say with concrete evidence that was exactly the case, but the resemblance to the video she showed me, to what his eyes looked like and his strange odd behavior, sure is uncanny how close they're related. Hi, what lurks beneath? Before I tell you this, I trust you'll keep my name anonymous, and my location anonymous as well. And I also trust that you'll at least hear me out, and if I'm lucky, read my story. I know you're a busy man, and so I bet with all the stories you get, you probably don't have much time. Well, here's mine, and feel free to use it if you'd like. I lived in the swampy areas of Illinois for a very long time. I was deer hunting in the swamps, about 3 years ago now. This day in particular was very foggy, and I was busy walking along a path in the swamp. I heard a noise that was not something I'm used to hearing. It was like this very fast pitter-pattering, except the pitter-pattering was not that of light weight. These were heavy, more like thuds against the ground. I knew it was something because, again, I never heard anything like this before. Thinking maybe it was an alligator, I got down, crouching and listening for a moment. It was actually coming up in the trees around me, not on the ground. I'm thinking to myself, what the? And then I hear branches kind of breaking and moving up in the trees around me. So I get up from a crouched position, and I'm looking around. Instantly, as I turn behind me, I see these glowing pairs of eyes looking at me. This was during the day, mind you, so my visibility wasn't exactly poor. What I was looking at, I have no explanation for. It was just this big creature. It looked very dinosaur-like, if I can describe it. I had a hard time seeing the entirety of the thing, even though the light was good, because of how it was holding onto the tree. It was kind of crouched, on a large branch, actually, higher up in the trees. It had a pretty big head, and looked to be bigger and taller than I was. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my truck, and I've never really sat down to tell anybody this before. but I know what I saw and it was not a deer. What this thing was, I don't know. To me, it reminded me of some failed genetic experiment somebody tried to do by splicing human and dinosaur DNA. Sure, it sounds like a science fiction plot gone wrong, but that's what I saw. This was back in 2016. I was with my friend Josh on a run in the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey. It was a cool autumn morning. The sun was out, and the leaves were just starting to change color. And it was the perfect morning for a run. We were running a trail, just for exercise and to get some good fresh air. A nice brisk pace always helps the body. And this particular trail was slightly challenging, with it being uphill. We were both talking about how nice it was out and how much we enjoyed being out here in the woods. So, here's a quick note, before I go any further with my story. Yes, I'm aware that Pine Barrens is home to all sorts of strange stories and encounters. Things like UFO sightings and bright lights, alien abductions, Bigfoots, and yes, even the Jersey Devil. I've heard it all. But I've never experienced anything myself. Never seen anything, never felt anything weird, and I've lived here for a long time. Not all my life, but enough time in the Pine Barrens, hiking and running around, that I feel like if those things were true, I would have seen something, at least by now. Well, that mentality that I had was proven wrong this day. As I was saying, we were running on this trail when, up ahead of us, we see something. Now bear in mind here, this is what we saw. We saw something big climbing out of the ground. At first, we kind of stopped thinking, what is this? But it happened very fast. This large, lizard-like thing pulled itself out of the ground within a matter of seconds, like it just kind of dug itself out. Think of how in the movies where it shows, zombies digging themselves out of a grave and pulling themselves up. It was similar to that, but it was way faster. It was like a slick, solid motion of just arms out, body coming up out of the ground, boom. I feel like the phrase pooping bricks is a severe understatement to how Josh and I felt. We were frozen, as this being had pulled itself out of the ground, and its expression was kind of stunned and shocked that we were there, like it wasn't sure how to react to the fact that we had seen it. And we were kind of just locked in this stare for, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds, before Josh just grabs me and takes off going the opposite direction. My body reacted and we both ran as fast as we could. Somehow, we managed not to scream, and I'm really surprised I didn't scream like a little girl after seeing what we did. We get all the way back down the trail and get back to the parking lot, where we stop and try to catch our breath. After heaving and breathing heavily, maybe a minute goes by and we're finally able to breathe enough to where we can ask each other, "What was that? Did you see that? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh." And yeah, I can't believe we saw that. What was that? None of us knew. None of us could even think about what it could have been. Like I told you already, I have lived here for at least 10 plus years and have never even heard or seen of anything remotely like that. Let me give you a good description of what it was, since we had such a good view of it. This thing was a dark green, almost black, and it was covered in scales. It had a body similar to a man, but very large clawed hands and feet, and the head was almost kind of like a velociraptor, at least in shape. The eyes were a very contrasty yellow, very piercing, actually. We never saw any teeth, but I guess the best description, I would call it, is a dinosaur man, because it was like half man, half dinosaur, I guess. I also didn't see its teeth, but this thing was also ripped. I mean, through its scales, you could see its rippling muscles, all over its arms, all over its chest and stomach. I did not see any genitalia. It was not wearing any clothing or anything to cover that. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to go back in those woods to find out, if we're honest. In my early teens, my brother and I would always go out to the backwoods to hunt for treasure. We often implored the use of a metal detector. We found all sorts of cool but useless stuff in hindsight: bottle caps, old knives, cans, forks, things like that. Nothing too exciting, but as a teenager, it was like striking gold. The adventure would usually start with us being out after dark, coming home muddy and exhausted. I mean, hey, it got us out into the woods and burned a lot of calories in the process. I guess this is why we always stayed in shape, which would come in handy for what would happen in this story. Let me just take a brief moment and explain the layout of the land. Our father owned a vast amount of acreage on the backside of our property. You had multiple creeks, and it kind of dipped down and you go further and further back, and then the land kind of goes up into a hill. Once you get to the top of this gradual slope, you could go back down again into a deeper section of valley that was all just forest upon forest. Now, during the fall season, my father would use these areas as hunting, and even had multiple deer stands set up all throughout there. My brother and I never really ventured that far out. I mean, we're talking hundreds of acres here. So, we generally stayed within maybe a mile or two at most of our own house. Don't quote me on the distance thing though. I really have no way to verify that measurement. It's just from my recollection. So, we often had this evening ritual. We'd be out there pretty much all day, playing and trying to look for stuff to hunt for treasure with, and of course, using our trusty metal detector. By about evening time, sometimes we would sit and relax, my brother and I, on top of the far back large hill, and just kind of hear the crickets slowly fade into the night, and see the weather and sky change. It was always really peaceful. Sometimes, well, more often than not, we would actually see foxes and deer. I can't dismiss it that it was really cool. But there was one night that I feel for me and my brother, but I can't speak for him. It kind of changed things. So we had a fairly normal day of hunting for treasure, and again, I don't believe we found anything extraordinary, at least not that I can recall. We were doing our usual of sitting atop this large hill, looking out into the night valley, or should I say almost night. That's when we started to hear sounds from the hill below us, something big moving around. My brother was the first one to hear it, as it got his attention first. He starts looking in that direction and knocks me on the shoulder, saying, "Hey, listen." And you could hear something big moving around. We thought it might be a buck or something, just due to the amount of noise it was making. But you could hear it was moving. And you could hear it wasn't walking, like the way a deer would. It was two-legged, whatever it was. And so now we're both really curious, trying to look through the trees and see if we can see anything. But we don't see anything. At this point, in the sky, it's pretty dusk. It's not totally blackout yet, but it's getting dark. And my brother and I were never afraid of walking back to the house at night, since we knew this part from the hill back to our house pretty well, and we were pretty hardy teenagers. We just kept thinking, there's no way somebody's back here. I mean, the only way to access it is you'd have to go all the way around, maybe another 40 or so acres in either direction. And quite frankly, if somebody was out here, they would have a lantern or some sort of flashlight. And there's really nothing out here. It's not hunting season. There's nothing of value. There's no reason why anybody should be back here. And the other thing is this movement sounded like it was coming from something very large, much bigger than just a man. All these thoughts are going through my head, and I'm sure my brother's at the same time. And we're looking, and we're looking. And then, my brother and I at the same time in unison see these red glowing eyes just appear down in the bottom of the hill, and they're moving up towards us. I believe again, my brother sees it first, and he hits me on the shoulder, and he says, "Look," and points. And we both see it. This figure, this tall figure is coming towards us with red eyes. I remember saying, "What is that?" and it gets closer and closer. And I think at this point, we were both so scared we couldn't even get up to move. I know the natural instinct is to probably get up and run, but when you're that terrified, on a primal fear level, it's different. It grounds you in a way that you can't physically react like you're supposed to. It got closer and closer till the shadows and darkness of the tree coverage became lighter and lighter, and we could start to make out what it was. It's almost like the lack of darkness allowed this thing to be illuminated by whatever little light there was supplied by the stars and the moon. My brother and I got a front row show to the horror of whatever this creature was that certainly was far from anything human. And after seeing it with my own eyes, which I later verified with my brother in verbatim to make sure we saw the same thing, this looked like some sort of lizard alien thing. I'm not sure what else you'd call it, to be honest. But I can tell you, it had a flat face, slitted pupils, large red-yellow eyes, a very reptilian-shaped like head. It was very tall, not really built strong, full of muscles, like you would see in a bodybuilder, but more so very lanky in its torso and its arms and legs, and it had this large tail behind it. It was kind of like a large lizard man, I guess, if that's the best way to describe it. It never opened up its mouth, so I never saw any teeth, but I could tell that its face, like I said, was flat, and the nose had slits. It also never made any sounds, other than the crunching of leaves and coming up from the brush. It was maybe, 50 feet away from us, when my brother manages to jump up, grab me by the collar, and yank me and pull me. Somehow, like kick-starting a motor, that's all my legs needed in order to run back to the house. And at this point, it was dark. Maybe not pitch black, but darker. And the second we go running down the hill, back towards the slope up to our property, we can hear this thing now picking up its pace, chasing us, running behind us, and it's gaining quickly. Trust me, I did not look back. I know all about that. I was not going to risk that happen, and falling and tripping over a rock, and just being bait for whatever this thing was. Again, it never screamed or let any noise, just that it gave chase. We made it to the bottom of this hill, and the gradual slope back up to our house. I think it must have stopped either way, somewhere along before we hit the bottom, because afterwards we didn't see it anymore, or hear it, and I really have no idea what it was. We'd made it back, just in time. Our parents weren't home, and so I didn't want to tell them anything anyway. I talked to my brother, asked him, what do you think that was? Because we both saw the same thing. We're not crazy. We didn't just see stuff. We did not hallucinate. That thing was as real as flesh and blood can get. And it's safe to say we didn't sleep that much that night. As terrified as I was from the whole experience, I tried to think analytically. Like, okay, this is obviously some sort of large predatory animal, bipedal or not. Then I start thinking about the logistics. Well, there's a lot of food back there. Tons of deer, tons of bear and foxes, lots of food, lots of places to go undisturbed and hide. If there's anywhere there'd be some sort of creature like this, that backside of the property is exactly where you would find one. Although, I'm sure that my father has maybe had sightings himself, but he would never tell us, I'm sure. We had gone back there since multiple times, and yes, even at dusk, but we never saw this thing again. You might call me either brave or stupid for going back there, especially at dark. But, when you're a teenager, you think you're practically invincible, as we did. We felt that if we had a Bowie knife and the proper tools, we would be more equipped to handle a situation like that, which we kept on us all the time from that point forward, but never encountered it again, whatever it was. Back in the early 70s, I saw something that I will never be able to fully understand and will certainly never forget. I was just a teen at the time, and even now, I can still vividly see him. Growing up on the Jersey Shore, we spent a lot of our time on the beaches and in the water. There would be an occasional shark sighting now and again, and the beaches would be closed off. But it never lasted for long, and certainly on the stretch of beach we frequented, there weren't any actual attacks. Of course, that didn't mean that the sharks weren't out there, or that they weren't killing other things in the ocean. And sometimes, we'd run down to the shore after school let out, and find all sorts of half-eaten creatures that had washed up after Sharky had finished with their snack. Being teens, we were more morbidly fascinated rather than grossed out by it. It was often more a case of what was the sickest looking thing we could find. And I'm pretty sure the octopus that washed up with each of its tentacles bitten off halfway was one of the closest times I came to losing my lunch. But despite all of this, we never actually ever saw a shark. I wish we had, because what we did see one day, back in the early 70s, was way more frightening than any great white shark. And to this day, I have no idea exactly what it was. It was the end of summer, and it was evening time. Now, you may well have gotten an image in your head of the boardwalk and the places in Jersey which are heaving with tourists, and I apologize if I was misleading, as this particular area I'm referring to, where we used to hang out, wasn't so much private, but it was a bit more off the beaten track, so only locals tended to visit, which was fine by us, as oftentimes it was just there. Anyway, so, it was late summer, late evening, but not yet night, so it was getting dark, but we could still see okay. And what we saw, I'm just gonna come out and say it. We saw a gator man, or as I describe it later on, because we're not the only people to see this thing. A humanoid alligator. I was real grateful. I had some buddies with me at the time. Not just because it scared the crap out of me, but so I could prove I wasn't lying or hallucinating or something. After all, it was the 70s, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people were still using acid or smoking weed. But to be clear, we were not. In fact, we were all sober, and had been. Hell, my dad was a cop. He'd have beaten me black and blue if I ever did a drug. So, there were 4 of us, all completely sober, and we all saw this gator man. The best way I can describe him is he looked like a real tall alligator. Like, instead of having those tiny squat little limbs, so it looks like they're wandering about on their belly, it had arms and legs, the size and length of a person, but still covered in scales with claws, and a full of gator head with that long snout and huge teeth. It had reared up out of nowhere, in the ocean, but close enough for us to be able to see it. I think the water came up to like where its knees would have been. I have no idea what it did then, or where it went off to, because you can bet your bottom dollar that we ran out of there as fast as we possibly could, and did not look back. There were quite a few sightings of him that summer, enough for us to believe that it wasn't some sort of hallucination. But then he disappeared. What he was, why he was there, I'll never know, but I'll never forget him. When I was in college, I took a road trip with my roommate back to her home in Ohio for Thanksgiving. It was a long drive, to say the least, but the promise of a week of home cooking and free laundry was more than enough to make the journey worth it. My roommate was a lot of fun, and came from a huge family, most of which I'd be meeting over the next few days. So, the trip went by fairly quickly, as she joyously told me the various stories featuring Uncle Lenny or her cousin Susie. We made sure to take plenty of rest stops, and even had lunch at a mom and pop's roadside diner. We texted her mom whenever we had bars or service to let her know our progress. Things were going great. Then, we came to this strip of highway that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was like something straight out of a serial killer movie, and we laughed and joked about finding a broken down car on the side of the road. A Bundy-esque dude just waiting to club us over the head. Of course, since I'm writing into you to tell you this story, you know that didn't happen. Also, you talk about cryptid monsters and not humans. Anyway, whilst we were laughing and planning on how we would escape and be final girls, we did see something on the side of the road. But it was Bundy or BTK, obviously. This thing seemed much smaller than a person to start with. And as we got closer, at first, we presumed it was some kind of dog. I don't know why, to be honest, because even as we were approaching it, I could tell that it appeared to be a greenish color, and dogs don't tend to be that sort of shade. It also appears to stand up, because we could see legs. So, and we still are a little bit away. It looks like we are approaching something smallish, maybe around 4 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, and green. I can very distinctly remember that as we drove past it, as we were literally eye to eye looking at it out of the passenger window. Neither of us said a word. We were both completely silent for a good 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. My roomie did not slow down at all, but she didn't speed up either. We just kept rolling. Finally, I do remember folding my hands onto my lap and staring straight ahead out the windshield. Not looking at my buddy, I simply said, "Did you just see that really tall frog standing up like a person?" She then burst out in what seemed like a relieved laughter and exclaimed yes. We both had a nervous laugh for a bit, and to be honest, I'm not too sure that either of us could fully quite comprehend exactly what we had just driven past. I mean, it's not exactly an everyday occurrence to see Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows stood by the side of the road, is it? Of course, this guy wasn't dressed in clothes. That would be ridiculous. But he was like the size of a human child, and he was most definitely upright, on 2 bowed legs, not crouched down, ready to jump on all 4, like a regular frog would. It honestly went through my mind that maybe we had been poisoned or drugged by the coffee at the diner, because it couldn't possibly be real. But if we were, then we showed no other signs or symptoms. So what the hell did we see? Is there really a species of tall 2-legged frogs roaming the highways out here in Ohio? Was he trying to hitchhike? We'll never know. But we still often think about that frogman and what he is up to these days. I mean, after all, I think there was a pretty large swamp or marshland nearby. Either way, we try to make jokes about it, but it's still freaky because we both saw the exact same thing. I work in the mailroom for a huge corporate business. The hours are long, tedious, and repetitive, but the paycheck is good, and the company I have down there, even better. To keep ourselves from going mad, we often tell each other stories. Since we're all over 18, we will often try and freak each other out. Despite the business being worth millions, the mailroom is still a bit of a throwback and although our working area is fine, and the break room and bathrooms are clean, there are still a few old, dark, and dingy storage areas down there. I see myself as a bit of a master storyteller, and had been busy memorizing as much long creepypasta as I could find to keep the mantle of King of Creepy going as I possibly could. Urban legends, crappy remakes and sequels to movies that no one had ever watched, so they didn't know how the plotline went. I loved it. As soon as my shift started, I had people begging me to tell them more and more spooky stuff. So, in a way, it was typical that what happened down in one of those dark, damp, and dingy storerooms happened to me, as literally no one believed me. They all thought it was just another one of my stories, or that I was setting them up for a prank. But I wasn't. As I have already mentioned, the actual warehouse part where we spent most of our time, and the parts of the building that we used for breaks, was absolutely fine, and had been fitted out with damp proofing, AC in the summer, heaters in the winter. But, shut away down various old corridors was the oldest part of the building, where you only went once in a blue moon if you needed something specific. And it just so happened that a fuse had blown in the plug for the microwave, and, me being me, volunteered to head down to one of the rooms designated as a random storage, as I was sure that I had seen a box of batteries and other stuff down there. It had been raining non-stop for the last week or so, and it smelled even damper than usual the further I headed. There was obviously electricity down there, and lighting, just no heat, so it always smelled kind of rusty and a thick must. The walls even felt damp sometimes. The closer I got to the room, I thought that I could hear a sort of snuffling noise. I'm sure by now you figured I probably don't scare easy, but I still didn't want to come face to face with a rat, since they carry all sorts of nasty diseases. So, although not scared, I had my guard up, just in case. I did have my favorite work boots on, and I was a mean kicker, especially during school football. The noise got louder as I approached the door of the storeroom. It almost sounded wet, like something swallowing. It's really hard to describe. I threw open the door, my leg out in front of me, ready to kick or stomp on something. I don't know. It just felt like I needed to be ready for something. I pulled on the cord for the light, and the moment the room was illuminated, I saw it. And I will tell you exactly what I saw the best that I can. It was big. Not as big as me. But then, I'm only 6'4", and not many people are. But I figured it was easily over 5 feet. Whatever this was standing upright, on 2 legs just like you or me. It had very tiny arms that it held in front of itself. Not long, except it was at the side. It was very dark green, grainy looking, and scaly. I can 100% say that it looked lizard-like, because it had a very lizard head and face. It had a very long lizard mouth, and even a nose that looked very lizardy. Big, bugged-out yellow eyes on either side of its huge face. It looked freaky, but not necessarily fierce. This thing stood about 15 feet away from me, and was a small man-sized 2-footed lizard. I was convinced I was looking at some sort of alien, some sort of lizard alien. It looked at me, and I looked at him, or her, or it. It was androgynous. I'm saying him. I have no damn idea what sex it was. I slowly backed out and slammed the door. I ran back to the mailroom and told the others what I'd seen. I was met with an eruption of laughter, clapped them on my back, and offered high fives. A couple of them said they believed me, and came back down to the room to see for themselves. But of course, nothing. So it went down as a great prank. Another super story. Only I know what I saw. How it got down there, I have no idea. I know there are old windows on the far side of that storage room that could easily fit a large person through. But those haven't been messed with in a long time. And there are thick forest and woods surrounding the outside of this unit. Who knows? Do I really believe this thing came through the window and was stalking and waiting for the right time in that room? Not really. But I can't think of another reason why this thing was there. My granddad was a sailor, and he used to tell us all sorts of crazy stuff that he saw in the sea. In fact, a lot of the time, he would have a twinkle in his eye and the ghost of a smile as he told us. Like the time he supposedly met Blackbeard the pirate, or discovered an underwater city of gold. But there was one story that no matter how many times he retold it, I never saw that twinkle. And that makes me think of the stuff he used to make up to entertain us. This particular tale was true, to my belief. They were somewhere near the Caribbean when it happened. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, my grandfather has now been dead for at least 20 years. I heard this story when I was around 10, so that's 30 years ago, and it happened when he was younger than I am now. So he was not inspired by or retelling of a famous movie featuring Jack Sparrow. He and the crew had been aboard the ship for around a week or so, and everything was going well. They were well on track for whatever their end destination was, and in good spirits. Most of the men at the time were below deck, doing what sailors do. That's when a large splash was heard. A very large splash. Not remotely unusual when you're in the middle of the ocean, of course. But something told him to look out over the side of the ship. At first, he couldn't see what manner of creature was responsible for the sound, but he could see ripples in the water below. He seemed to recall it was around dusk, so although the blazing sun wasn't high in the sky, it was by no means completely dark yet. He also wasn't in the slightest bit frightened, merely curious, as if it were somehow playing with him. The creature refused to come back up to the surface whilst he was watching. He could see bubbles, so he knew something was down there. A lot of the sea life he had encountered were quite nosy, and he'd seen many dolphins, and even an octopus come right up to the ship, as if to say, "What are you doing in my ocean?" Knowing these things can be playful, he stepped back from the side of the ship, so his sightline of the water was obscured. And sure enough, as soon as he had moved back, he heard two loud splashes again, and a bang, and something bumped up against the bottom of the ship. Still not thinking it was anything that would be a potential threat, he raced back over to try and catch a glimpse. And he was rewarded by catching sight of the very end of a vibrant aqua green tail fin diving back under the water. He remembers thinking that it was the most beautiful color, and also, what on earth must be the fish that the tail fin was on? By now, his curiosity had peaked, but was still not afraid. Backing away slowly, he made sure he was out of sight. But this time, he crept quietly to the edge of the ship so that could pop up instantly and see what was down there. Maybe he discovered a new breed of fish. As I said, he was curious and now excited to see exactly what was playing hide and seek with him. He heard a bump and a splash, and this time shot up as quick as he could to look over the side. As I've said, whenever Granddad told us about meeting Long John Silver or surviving a battle with a kraken, we knew he was full of it, embellishing things to entertain us. He'd get really animated as he told us, and it often ended up with him making us jump and then smothering us in kisses. But I swear, when he told us this, there was none of that. If you can believe it, he actually paled, and there was a slight tremor to his voice. That was because this time, when he looked over, he did catch a fleeting glance of what was playing with him. It was a mermaid. Don't be fooled for 1 second that this thing had anything in common with Ariel. The best way that he was able to describe its body was that it looked like Nosferatu with long hair, a gnarled bony body, and a fin. Can you even imagine that? Nosferatu's twisted features with huge warped fangs, wide gaping eyes, but instead of a bald head, long straggly wet hair covered and thick in seaweed. Then, instead of a human body, the rancid, almost concave bony structure with visible ribs and 2 shriveled, wrinkled chest bones. The only thing to indicate properly that it was indeed a creature of another world. The only thing similar to the Disney film was her fin, which was indeed quite beautiful, and the scales shimmered in the setting sun. Of course, as soon as the creature realized it had been seen, it dove back under the water and never resurfaced. Granddad said of course they all knew the legends of sirens who were meant to be beautiful enchantresses who lured sailors with their beauty and song, and then usually killed them and ate them. If that had been a siren, then it must have taken a very drunk or desperate man to succumb. Whatever it was, it absolutely terrified my father and my granddad. He never saw anything like it again. But a year or so after that, he stopped sailing permanently and swore to always stay on land from then on out. Thanks for hearing my story. My determination to never own a car is what ultimately led up to the building blocks of this very story. I can't afford to completely live off the grid, but I do everything I can to distance myself from life of dependence. You know, I don't use money unless I have to. I won't be caught dead using a bank. I earn only as much money as I'll have to use. Everything else I try to accomplish with my own 2 hands. The system wants to shackle these hands. Your hands too. I think it's because of the determination to resist that I ended up having this encounter in the first place. Some of the money that I can't do without is my bus fare. I will not own a vehicle, so I need to get to where I'm going with the buses that are always crawling all over Manhattan. It's not a bad way to do things. It beats being tied down to a payment and repairs and maintenance costs. Gosh, and freaking insurance. So, when you're taking the bus as often as I, you get to know the patterns of the faces of the people that you see. You get a feel for who works in the morning, or who has errands to run in the afternoon, or who the night workers are. Just for the hay of it, I began taking different buses, just to see the different crowds. It took me several runs to see it, but I began to catch on to that no matter which bus I was on, there was always one person that always was there with me. He was an old man that looked like an old woman if you didn't look close enough. He looked a little on the homeless side, a little on the mentally ill side. He looked a little on every side. A virtual human kaleidoscope with an oversized cowboy hat that's been crushed more than once. A Hawaiian shirt that was usually unbuttoned, and pink shorts and sneakers. He was always carrying some variation of paper or plastic shopping bags. He never smiled, and never really made eye contact with anyone. You'd think somebody that loud would stand out right away. But I can't describe the way he always kind of blended in with everything. I mean, he was so out there. He was ordinary. Anyway, no matter which bus I took, there was at some point a crazy idea beginning to form in the back of my head that would not be ignored. I got the notion that he was following me, so I was going to follow him back. The first few times I tailed him, I really didn't think he was aware of me, but I've been doing things long enough to know the revelation comes with persistence. He would stay on the bus for several cycles through the route, as if it were a means of sightseeing. But then, he would get off at a stop and sit down and wait for another bus. Then, he'd ride that one through its route several times. I don't think I ever observed him stopping to use the bathroom anywhere. He just kept going. My bladder and bowels would always seem to scream before his did. Things came to a head that day, and I had finally given up and decided that he was just a derelict old man that had nothing better to do with his twilight years than surf the mass transit system the way most people of later generations surf the internet. Well, then he got off at the downtown junction, where all the routes converged at once. He got off the bus, waited for another one, got on. I kid you not, no more than 10 minutes later, a completely different bus arrived and the same guy got off, waited, got on. Either those buses did some serious moving in 10 minutes, or something else was up. I did some acid back in my younger days, and I started to wonder if those permanent tendencies towards flashbacks were a culprit. But the notion started to gel in my head that there was one of him on every single bus at any given time. The more I shadowed him, the more I watched how often the buses would trade him at the junction. That became the only viable explanation. I started going to ridiculous lengths, working longer hours so I could have more money to buy those little microcams that are so cheap nowadays. I could collect footage from different buses. I know that sounds crazy, but the way we're kept asleep and oblivious to all this stuff is even crazier. Catching on to this was just part of the way I was becoming awakened. Sure enough, he was everywhere. Nobody else was everywhere, just him. He never met himself. His movements were perfectly coordinated, so that two of him would never be seen in the same place at the same time. I couldn't think of any purpose this arrangement would serve, until it hit me while I was relocating one of my cameras. Surveillance. They were somebody's eyes and ears. It would be too obvious if it were the bus driver. Put it up to somebody that is so ordinary and so quiet that nobody gives them a second look. I felt woke in that moment. I felt empowered. I had all the footage I needed to make my case and put together like a documentary. All I needed was something involving a confrontation. Candid footage of me calling him out without giving him a chance to rehearse. I made my move at one of the times that he was at the downtown junction, very early on in the morning, when he was really the only person there. I came on strong, like I might know even more than I was letting on. His eyes roamed me up and down, like some sort of mechanical scan. I became aware of a hissing sound that coincided with his breathing. He looked me in the eyes, but then somehow looked into me. I felt invaded, like he could see me without my clothes on. My vision tunneled, and he was at the focus of it all. Then, his lips moved and made some series of syllables that I couldn't derive words from. Green scales appeared on his skin, as if they had been retracted inside of his pores or something. A long tongue even darted out between his lips and wagged at me, and he made the first facial expression I had ever seen on him. A sinister grin, revealing multiple pointed, jagged teeth. Then, I felt like I was hit in the face with a sledgehammer. I woke up underneath one of the small trees surrounding the downtown junction. I didn't know how long I was out, but it felt late. I wasn't missing anything. I had one of the cams in the breast pocket of my hoodie when he turned snake-like in front of me. I thought I was going to strike a big one in the name of woke. But when I got my cams and stuff home, they had been wiped. All footage I'd ever taken just showed white noise. What's more, all of his copies disappeared, and I never saw him or anyone like him again. I've heard about snake people being in the upper areas of business and government, but I got a serious chill thinking about what they would want by taking their game all the way down to the bottom, watching over ordinary people like me that blow in and out of the wind like litter. Are they keeping tabs on all of us that closely? And what kind of voodoo was it that knocked me out? A spoken word cut my lights out. Maybe that's how they work. Maybe that's part of how they hide in the broad daylight. They don't just blend in. They got some kind of voodoo magic going on. I don't know. Like some sort of supernatural power. Look out if you keep seeing someone familiar on public transportation. They might just be a sleeper cell, waiting, listening, watching. I remember in 5th grade, we got a substitute teacher that stayed much longer than any sub should have. She was large and loud, and the only part of her that wasn't ridiculously big was her feet. Her thighs were like freak of nature beets that had slender roots for her to walk on. We kept asking her when Mrs. Wimmer was going to come back. She would just tell us soon enough, but we lost track of how long our real teacher was absent. It had to have been weeks. One day, she told us that we're going to watch a film so amazing that we would watch it for the duration of the day, breaking only for lunch and recess. I had no idea what kind of film would run for so long. Just before she started up the film, I had to get up and use the bathroom. I should have asked for permission, but it hit me so hard that I couldn't risk a no. When I got back, the television rack was already in front of the class, and white static filled the screen. Those of you old enough to remember those days know that meant the video was starting soon. But the video never started. I stared, patiently waiting for the black leader of the first few inches of film to be read. It never did. While I was waiting, everyone in the classroom burst out into laughter. It died down. It was as if something funny had happened on the TV. It happened again. I looked into the static with confusion. There was nothing there. No sound, nothing. It was one of those screens that were rounded. Such were the old makes. In a corner, I saw a reflection of the lamp at the teacher's desk, and the teacher's face lit up by it. And the reflection, distorted all kinds of ways, was something that made me catch my breath once I worked it out. Something just as scaly and hideous as a crocodile was sitting at that desk. I whirled around to see the very human teacher sitting behind the desk, but she was looking straight at me, and the eyes I saw then were the same eyes I saw in the corner of the TV screen reflection. There was more laughter around me from everybody, and the teacher smiled, a very evil, sinister smile. I feigned illness for as long as possible, until my act fell apart. By then, Weeks later, there wasn't a classroom to go back to. One of my classmates went on to do extremely violent acts. His excuse was that the teacher had taught him both through lessons and through videos that it was the right thing to do. As far as I know, that substitute teacher was never known of. I've used Google and white pages, and all else using what little information about her I could find. It's like tracking down a ghost, or a chameleon that disappears into the background. Either way, seeing that crocodile of a person left me terrified, and I have no idea if she came from this Earth, or another planet, or the pits of hell itself. All I know is that it, assuming that's what it was, disguised itself as a person, because its intentions were not the same. Since lockdown, I've had to do a lot more outdoor exercise as and when I can, since the gym hasn't been open. Also, the thought of attending a class with tons of people, using equipment, even if it had been wiped down, is just kind of gross. So, I've been trying to spend a lot more of my time walking. Running isn't really my thing. Bad for your joints and your knees. No thanks. But I can walk for hours, and it's been really good on keeping the pounds off and my appetite down. Because I've been doing this for a couple of months, I'm always trying to find a slightly different route. I pop on my sneakers, earbuds go in, and off I go, out for a few couple hours. It was on one of those evenings just a couple weeks ago when I had spontaneously decided that I wanted to stay out a bit longer and head somewhere different. I try to keep on the sidewalks as much as possible, better for my ankles, and less chance of coming across any potential serial killers in the woods. But that evening, something drew me to the woods. It wasn't pitch black dark, but certainly a lot darker in the trees than it had been on the sidewalk with all the street lamps lit up. As I was power walking my way through, I had this weird feeling in my gut. It was almost like I'd been drawn. I actually started to speed up a bit more, cursing myself for going in there when it was dark, and I could not see well, not even knowing where the way out was. I was beginning to panic a little when I bumped into something. Since this happened, I have read many cryptid encounters to see if I can find anything similar. It definitely seems like I was pretty unlikely to actually bump into mine. Most people just see a fleeting glimpse from afar, but mine knocked me off my feet, literally. It was like speed walking into a brick wall. I was stunned and terrified. My first logical thought was that I had literally walked into a tree. As soon as I ran into whatever it is I did, I fell and looked up. That's when I began scrambling, because I saw eyes and a terrifying solid figure that was moving before me. I got a really good look. Whatever this was robust and incredibly large. It didn't wobble though. Whatever it was solid, just completely giant solid mass. I couldn't really make out arms or legs. It must have just been what I'd hit. Then I continued to look up. This thing was around maybe 8 or 9 feet tall. I'm talking huge, easily double the size of a bodybuilder. It was piercing yellow eyes. When most people see monsters, they run away. But I was just stuck in total fear and anxiety. That's when this thing opened its mouth, and everything around me went into slow motion. I couldn't make out any details, but at the same time, I could. This awful screech came out. That's when I saw the bazillion tiny little teeth that accompanied its mouth. It was a long, gnarly snout, and that's when it appeared to have little appendages sticking off of its mouth, like odd little tumorous growths, and it was scaly and gross looking, as if you took like a giant lizard or something, maybe a Komodo dragon, blended it with the DNA of a human and a few other random animals, and then mutated it by sticking it in toxic waste. I don't know what else to call it. It was hideous the more my eyes adjusted to it. I did my best to regain composure, slowly, very slowly, crawl away, and after I got about 10 feet away, it just looked at me, strangely, as if it wasn't sure what I was doing. Then, as if alerting itself to a sound, it quickly snapped its head to its right, looked back at me, looked back in the direction that it heard a sound from, I guess, and then quickly followed it. I took that as an opportunity to bail. Now, I look back at this, and I don't know exactly what I saw, but after doing some research, I can't exactly pinpoint what it would have been. Bigfoots don't match the description. Either does a dogman. I don't even know if I saw a lizard man. Even though it did look reptilian in a way, it was far too grotesque and ugly. What do you think of my story? What exactly could I have encountered that night? Sometimes you see something and your brain just can't quite compute. You know, like when you hear about people that have been through massive traumas. Just forget it, or make up another variant of events to protect their brain. Your mind can do that too when you see something weird. You can be looking at it, and your mind is just in a hell no mode. That cannot be what you are seeing. That it's not even possible. That is why I refuse to believe that I had seen a lizard man just walking down the road on the way home. I must have had more to drink than I realized, and I must have been watching the sci-fi channel too much, or so I thought. All the excuses and rationale I could think of to not accept that I had actually seen a human-sized humanoid lizard. I even managed to convince myself that maybe I dreamt it. Because of this, I didn't tell anybody about it. After all, what would I say? People would think I had lost it. So when I was down at the pub a few weeks later, and one of my friends began on about his girlfriend, saying she'd seen this massive creature walking down the road, I nearly just laughed at him. He, of course, was saying that his girlfriend must have been crazy, or on something that doesn't exist, or that maybe she had been reading too many scary stories. As we began laughing and joking, to prove his girlfriend was imagining stuff, and clearly crazy, he said he was going to walk along this road on his way home, and look out for the same thing, just in order to mock his girlfriend. Since that was the way I was going, and the exact place I had seen this thing, when he was getting ready to head out, I downed my beer and told him I'd join him. I didn't know what to think. Did I want to see it? Would I prove something? Or was I hoping for some sort of really weird coincidence, and we both just had the same highly unusual hallucination? I was feeling more and more uncomfortable as my friend was just laughing and messing about. He kept making stupid noises, pretending to be a ghost or something, when we both suddenly stopped dead still. We had both heard some definite movement coming from the tree line next to us. That's when he wasn't looking so good. He was muttering under his breath. It's probably a fox or a rabbit. When he was ready to be literally for anything. Then, this thing stepped out onto the road, and like a snake, it even hissed. It was nearly 6 to 7 feet tall, a little bit taller than both him and I. To be quite honest with you, this thing resembled something right out of a comic book. Naked, green and scaly. Well, I think it was more brown, come to think of it. But it was clearly ugly, and it resembled what it would look like if you took a human and mixed it with that of a lizard. It was also terrifying. It had an elongated face, 2 sharp, snake-like eyes, and large teeth protruding from its upper jaws. And with a mouth that big and wide, filled with tiny dagger-like teeth, they came a long tongue that shot out. It looked at us with such an intensity, not only shock that it was shocked we were there, but looked at us as if it was pissed that we had seen it. That was enough. We both turned and ran as fast as we could. It never did give chase. As far as I could tell, I think it just walked back where it came, but I never did look over my shoulder. Nobody else ever saw it, and they still think the 3 of us would have did taken some sort of wacky-backy, but we know what we saw. A lizard man in the flesh. My dad is a keen fisherman and has traveled all over the country to participate in competitions. He also used to, and I stress here, used to try and find the way out of middle-of-nowhere type spots, in case he could catch something that would get him instant global recognition in the cutthroat world of fishing. But you see, he actually did come across something. Only it wasn't a fish, and it frightened him so much. He no longer goes anywhere unless it is completely out in the open and he is surrounded by the presence of others. This was somewhere out in Georgia where he had the experience. I'm not sure where exactly, as he refused to tell us the exact location, just in case we wanted to go looking for it. He had heard of some elusive fishing spot, where apparently the fish were huge, and there had even maybe been talk of undiscovered species of fish. That was more than enough to pique his interest, so off he went. He was going to be gone for 4 days. He came back after only 1 night, looking dead. He just walked straight into the kitchen and sat down. He wasn't really talking at first, and my mom and all of us were very worried. But then he went on to tell us that he found something that shouldn't exist. That's when my mom kept asking him about the wound in his hand, and he just said it was a mistake. It was all a mistake. Then he kind of casually just started talking out loud, almost hysterically. It was disturbing. He was telling us that he was out there fishing when a large walking alligator attacked him. When we were asking him, "What do you mean a large walking alligator?" he said it was an alligator, but it wasn't quite an alligator. He said it looked like one, but it walked on 2 legs, had bigger legs and longer, bigger arms, and nearly tried to grab him and pull him into the water. That it came after him, rushing after him in his tent. After that, we all just kind of sat quietly, not really sure what to make of his story. I love my dad, and I wanted to support him fully, but I didn't know what to think. My dad's a church-going guy. He doesn't make up stories, nor would he. And why would he cut his own trip short and come home looking like this? There's nothing for him to gain out of it. The wound on his hand, he told us, was when it grabbed him and gashed his flesh. This thing came out of nowhere, he said, what he believes was hiding in the bog, waiting for the right time to strike. He said it was larger than any gator he has ever seen, and has never seen or heard of any gators that supposedly walk on 2 legs. He kept calling it the Gator Man, but I don't really know what to think of it. We all, including my mother, just comforted him and just tried to listen and were there. After a while, he went to bed. Honestly, it's kind of disturbed me even to this day. We would always be there for my dad. I wasn't really sure what to make of it. Story 1. The Florida Lizard Man. Hi, what lurks beneath. I'm reaching out to you because you seem to have a lot of answers to a lot of people's cryptid problems. See, back in January of 2019, I saw something that I think is the Lizard Man, but I'm not too sure, because I know for a fact There is no known animal that looks like what I saw, and I know there are only a handful of animals that exist that are even bipedal. Back in January of 2019, I was driving northbound on the 301, just north outside of Jacksonville, Florida, when, from the right side of the road, came this giant lizard-looking thing. It was upright and taller than my car. It looked like part man, part iguana, at least in the body, but the head was something else entirely. It was almost prehistoric looking, like if you took the head of a dinosaur and slapped it on a lizard man body. The body, if you look at just about any fan fiction art of what a lizard man is supposed to look like, well, there's only a few definitions, and this thing pretty much fit the stereotypical definition. Covered in scales, rippling muscles, 2 arms, a broad chest, legs just like a person, and a large tail, with a head that was very dinosaur-like. It actually kind of reminded me of the head of the Tyrannosaurus Rex from the Jurassic Park films. I can tell you that I did see the eye, and the eye was almost identical. That small pinpoint yellow eye. But it was so quick that I didn't catch the best glimpse in the world. It was broad daylight, about 1:30, maybe 1:45 p.m. in the afternoon, and this thing came from the right side of the road, quickly jumped over both lanes into the 10-foot grass median, then cleared the other oncoming lanes in another jump. This thing happened, or cleared the road, in roughly about 3 to 4 seconds, from it appearing on the right side, all the way to the swamps to the left. I was shocked and could not believe what I had seen. Unfortunately, I was by myself, so there was nobody I could call or say, "Did you see that?" I even questioned afterwards if I was going crazy, or if I really did see that. There was not much traffic on this area of the road at the time, so I'm pretty much the only one that saw it. Now, my question is to you. Are you able to read this to your viewers, so maybe they could help me find out exactly what I saw? I've only ever heard of Bigfoot, and I had no idea nothing else like this even existed until I saw it with my own eyes. I know for a fact it was not a human in a costume, because number one, it looked way too realistic, even the quick glimpse that I saw of it, and two, no human, not even a world-winning athlete, can move and jump that fast. It was not human, and if it was a human, they were supernaturally agile, which, again, I think concludes my case that I am certain I saw a cryptid. Could it have been a lizard man? Do lizard men even exist? Well, I found the answer to that. After seeing this and then doing some research, I came upon the Scape Ore sighting, dated back to the 80s. I'm sure you already know about that. But judging by his drawing that the boy drew, this thing didn't look like that. So I ended up down a rabbit hole, which led me to your Reptilian Encounters playlist. And after going through about 3 or 4 of them, I figured contacting you was my best bet. So, what do you think I saw? Story 2. Alligator Killer. This happened to my father about 15 to 16 years ago, somewhere around 2005. He does not go to this fishing spot anymore, due to what he described to me that he had seen, and I've known about this for a long time. We live south of Houston, southeastern Texas, and yes, before I go on with my story, we do have an abundant amount of alligators. They're actually a part of the freshwater ecosystem here, so if you're surprised to find that out, then I'm sure you'll even be more surprised to find out what happened next. There's a little spot that my father, he thinks was a private spot or private property, but he snuck on there and fished for years without ever being bugged. He thinks it was either federally owned or that it was somebody's property that only hunted on it. I agree that he shouldn't have been fishing on that spot for the time that he did, because, well, he could have gotten in a lot of trouble had he got caught. so maybe it's a good thing this happened to keep him out. He was fishing at this spot, and he'd seen alligators many times. They're not really an issue for him. But he saw something more horrific than an alligator. He said when he was fishing, he saw this, what he thought was an alligator, rise up out of the water on two legs, which appeared to be more horrific and larger than any alligator he had seen. This thing had picked up a nearby alligator out of the water, and before his very own eyes, ripped it in half from head to tail. Not vertically speaking, but horizontally, to where if it ripped it in half, its guts and belly would be ripped open, and innards would spew everywhere. That's exactly what happened, and this massive hippopotamus lizard thing was eating off the guts. That's kind of what my dad called it. Half lizard, or half alligator, and half hippopotamus. He mentioned the hippopotamus because he said its face kind of reminded him of that. Very ugly, very flat, with a very large snout. But not like that of an alligator or a lizard, to where it's narrow and slender. Very wide, with massive husks and very sharp teeth. It was also very large and tall, brown and whitish in color, but covered in dark, slimy scales, and appeared to have massive arms and hands like a human, which he mainly just calls it a hippopotamus alligator thing, which I know isn't that descriptive, but he doesn't know what else to call it. Anyway, he sees this thing rise up out of the water, grab the alligator, rip it in half, and start eating on its innards. That was enough for him. He got out of there ASAP, and now it's been nearly 15 years since he saw that thing. He doesn't know what it is. He knows there's wildlife that he's never seen before, but he's pretty sure that he's never heard of that, nor has anybody else. I remember, back when that happened, he came home and told me about it, and we still talk about it now and to this day. We've even spent time looking it up, and nothing we can find points to a creature or any animal that matches or fits that exact description. Story 3. Avoid Mud Lake. Back in September of 2019, when I was visiting Mud Lake in Louisiana, which, by the way, is an amazing hotspot for redfish, I was attacked by something I can only describe as a dinosaur on two legs. Had I not gotten away in time, I believe it would have killed me. I'm out on my small boat, and I already have my line casted into the water. I hear noise from brush, off in the distance. I turn up to see this freakish-looking thing coming out of the brush and staring right at me. I nearly dropped my rod in the water right there. This thing looked like a dinosaur, except it looked part human, like what you'd imagine from Jurassic Park if they took humans and dinosaurs and spliced them together, DNA. Then, this thing crouched down, just like a person, and dove into the water. Then, it started swimming rapidly towards my boat. In a panic, I ended up dropping my entire rod into the water, and got my boat going, and I got out of there quickly. But as I was going, this thing was keeping up with my boat, and following me at crazy speeds. I got to a certain point to where I think I lost it, because I could not see it anymore. I am sorry my encounter isn't very long, but the experience shook me very deeply. I have never seen anything like that in all my 34 years of fishing, and I've never seen or heard anything like that from friends and colleagues alike who have spent so much time out here fishing and enjoying the wildlife around the Louisiana area. One important note that I do want to leave you with is I had a buddy about 6 years ago who claimed he had seen a werewolf or some sort of dog canine humanoid. That was back in the north area of Louisiana. This was years ago, and I always used to make fun of him for it, thinking he had just simply misidentified a black bear or was just making stuff up. But now that I know the possibilities are more real than they ever have been, maybe I'm not so sure. Story 4. Attempted break-in. Just back in October, I had a terrifying break-in experience, or a near break-in experience. I live alone. I'm a little older, so my kids are moved out of the house, and my wife passed years ago. I don't own any guns, but after this, well, I'm definitely rethinking about that. Something tried to break into my tiny trailer. What it was, I didn't get a great look at it, but I did see something. I know this is going to sound crazy, but hear me out. This thing looked like a velociraptor, or something of that nature. Some sort of large lizard or reptile, but it was standing upright and standing taller than my trailer, which my trailer is around 10 feet tall. Another reason I was so incredibly frightened. This thing was massive, very broad, easily 4 or 5 feet across, which sounds unrealistic. But if you saw this thing, or caught a glimpse, you would just see how disproportionate and how weird this thing looked. It was a very dark green, if not black color, and tried to wiggle the door handle, walked all around the house, and even rammed up against the back side of the trailer several times. It did this for roughly 2 hours, between the hours of 11:35 p.m. and around 2 in the morning. I thought to call the police, but I figured they wouldn't be much help. I just tried to ride it out, which I know, in hindsight, was probably a really poor decision. If this thing would have broken in, which of that size, I'm surprised it didn't, I wouldn't be here right now. I've never heard of such a thing being so intelligent that it knew what a door handle was and tried to violently wiggle it as if to open it. But the size of this thing, it could have broken down my door had it really wanted to, but it didn't. It could have shattered a window and broken in and got me, but it didn't. It's like it wanted to terrify me, just let me know it was there. Or maybe like a cat who had trapped a mouse and waited, deciding not to kill it, but yet just to instill fear, to let it know that it's there and can get you anytime. This was back around mid-October, and I have not seen or dealt with it since. Before then, I have never heard of this thing, and I have never had any nightly visits from it. This is the one and only time. It was extremely traumatic, and even though I mentioned the gun thing, I've decided against it for the time being, which is why I haven't gotten one yet. I know that doesn't make sense, but with all the ammunition and guns at an all-time high, I'm just kind of worried about buying one, that for some reason, maybe if I try to purchase one, I'll get in trouble. I don't know. I live at the end of a small road. Not very rural, but not anywhere near the city. I have a couple neighbors around me, mostly elderly, which they don't really get out much or even talk much. I think the man in the house near me is in a wheelchair and doesn't have a caretaker. There's a lady by the front end of the street. She's also, I believe, in her 70s or 80s and doesn't go out much or say much, so it's a very small community of people that don't really intermingle. So I'm not exactly sure if they've had their own run-ins with this thing. I'm thinking, though, of maybe going over there and talking with them. Maybe they've seen this thing too. If you or anybody you know has a story or encounter they would like to share with me, please send it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. You can find the email in the description below. Back when I was about 10 years old, me and my little brother, who was 7 at the time, used to play in the back area of our house, which, at the time where we lived, was thick and lush with swampland. Well, the story I have for you happened one day when we got a little too far into the swamp and became lost. We played in this swamp very often, and we'd like to know that we think we knew our way around, which was not evident this day. I think we were playing adventurer and pretended to use sticks as swords, and probably wandered too far and lost track of time. This wasn't exactly unusual, But this particular day, I feel that we wandered a little too far in a direction we were unfamiliar with. The sun began to set, and I remember telling my little brother we should get back before it gets too late and we get stuck out here in the dark. That was when we began to feel this strange feeling of being watched. I know there are dangerous animals that live in the swamplands, like water moccasins and alligators, but we had a pretty general idea of how to avoid those animals and where they were. So, we were very careful where we treaded. But this was something else entirely, a feeling I never felt in the swamp, and I asked my brother about it too. He said he was feeling the same thing. That's when I began to look around, but didn't see anything. So I kind of just chalked it up to the fear of it getting dark and being a little lost. We weren't entirely lost. I had a general idea of the direction we came from. So, being a good big brother, I helped lead my brother in the direction that we came from. Unfortunately, it only began to get darker, and we had no light with us. I feel at some point, we got turned around, because the brush we were in was very thick, and even the way back to the house wasn't exactly easy unless it was daylight. I feel like we somehow missed a turn, or did something, like darkness can cause you, and we somehow trailed further into the swamp, in an area I quickly realized we were unfamiliar with. That's when my little brother, being only 7, noticed this, and began to really panic. I tried my best to calm him down, and to be as brave as a 10-year-old can be, when that horrible feeling came over me again, that I was being watched. But the feeling is more than that. It's not just literally being watched. It's like someone is watching you with the intent on hurting you. It's a horrible feeling. The best way I could chalk it up is complete and utter dread in the pit of your stomach. I kept looking around nervously while trying to comfort my crying little brother, when I saw what looked to be a pair of eyes off in the thick trees not too far away. I tried my best to not let my brother see, while trying to console him and keep my eyes on whatever it is I was seeing. I quickly thought it was just an animal, but the more it stood there stationary, staring at us, the more my eyes began to adjust to the darkness around, and realized this was a large shape attached to these eyes. I began frantically turning back between my brother and this shape. When I looked back at this shape for the 5th or 6th time, and it began to move slowly back behind the trees so I couldn't see it. That's when I began hearing loud snapping of branches and moving. Something very large was moving through the brush, over to the direction we were at, but still remaining hidden, like it did not want to be seen. Keep in mind the eyes of this thing were high up in the air, so whatever this was tall. And the eyes, they were like this white glow. It's hard to describe. Kind of in the same vein as when you shine headlights into an animal's eyes. It's that reflective membrane animals have in their eyes. I'm not sure what it's called exactly, but that's exactly what it looked like. Except there were no lights being shined into this creature's eyes, whatever it was. I was beginning to get terrified, and luckily, at this point, my little brother was still very much ignorant of what was going on. Thank the Lord. I grabbed him, and I told him we need to get out of here now, before it gets too dark. I tried to instill as much as my false bravery as I had at the time into him, so we could get back home and be safe. Right then is when we heard a crashing sound through the brush. Whatever this was that I was looking at was now trying to barrel towards us in the thicket. Now I was even more afraid than I had ever been. And now my little brother had known. He looked too, now freaking out. Like I said previous, we both had a general idea of the wildlife in the swamp, and we knew that such large animals did not exist in the swamp. Well, alligators are large, but they're not going to come barreling towards you in the thicket. We decided to run as fast as we could in the direction that we had hoped was home. I don't know why, at 10 years old, I never thought to bring a light with me. I guess at the time, I must have felt a false sense of security being in the swamp during the day and not thinking we'd be in this predicament. We began running, and this creature began chasing after us, barreling through, breaking branches. It sounded like something big, stomping and thrashing around. And then we began to hear a snarl, a growl. But it wasn't like a big wildebeest or a big bear. It had a very hiss quality to it, kind of like a large alligator or a snake. It was terrifying, to say the least. My little brother began crying again as he started to lose his momentum, and we slowed down. What's weird is I slowed down with him to try and get him to come with me. But this thing slowed down too, and did not continue barreling throughout the brush to try and grab us, even though I'm sure it could have, with how fast it was coming. When we came to a full stop, so did it, and that's when I truly felt my own stomach turn completely sour. Whatever this was keeping tabs on us, stalking us. I kept looking around, and now my brother, scared, was also looking around. We couldn't see anything, but I could hear it breathing, this heavy, raspy breath. I knew it was just out of sight. It could not have been more than 15 or 20 feet out of reach. The area we were in, or the portion of swamp, was very, very thick. This went on for quite some more time, and I felt like we were playing a game of cat and mouse. And now that my brother, unfortunately, was aware of our pursuer, we were just running and crying, while also trying our best to find our way back through the swamp, back to our home. Sometimes, I was convinced we'd be stuck in there forever, and I was convinced that we also were running in circles, seeing the same bog and the same thicket over and over, and yet this thing continued to pursue us, hot on our tail, but never fully revealing itself. I don't understand why it never did show itself and get us, because if it was really that intent on following us, it had multiple opportunities to trap us and get us, but it never did. In fact, we never fully saw it, whatever it was. We saw glimpses of it through the trees, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it looked like, other than the eyes and the general shape. My brother and I's energy was running on very thin. At this point, with it being so dark, we were running on pure adrenaline. We really had nothing to go on. That was when I told my brother, "Shh." I could faintly hear my mother's voice, calling us. She sounded worried, scared. I told him, "That's Mom, let's go." And we ran and ran in the direction that we heard her voice. It seemed like we ran for another 20 or 30 minutes, but in reality, it was probably no more than 5. I feel like we got to a clearing where we could break through the trees and off the long hill that led back up to our house. We made it, I thought. But behind us, our pursuer never stopped. It began to get more aggressive, more angrier the longer it chased us around, but never showing itself. It began to hiss and growl more, and the growls and sounds that it made were very similar to that of an alligator. And as we made it up back to our house, our pursuer never did chase us out of the thicket. It never revealed itself. It turns out, the area we came out of was the complete opposite side of the house that we entered into the swamp at. We must have completely got turned around at some point, and wandered all the way around into the swamp, while completely missing the mark on the map where our house is. I guess darkness will do that to you. And being in the thick bog, we're very fortunate we did not get seriously injured, or attacked, or God knows what else. Our mother had been calling us for quite some time, and she was deathly worried. In fact, so much so, that we were pretty severely punished, not being allowed to go back into the swamp for quite some time, because, well, we lost track of time and I guess disobeyed. But my brother and I didn't mind being punished in that regard. It kept us away from whatever that thing was. We never told our mom exactly what had happened, just that we were running and tried to find our way home, and then we got lost. That's honestly a story that I never really forget, and it stayed with me for a very, very long time. I wouldn't say it was exactly traumatic, but it did leave an impact. Unfortunately, I don't get the opportunity to talk about it with my little brother. As of now, I'm 27, almost 28, so this happened quite a while ago. My little brother passed away years ago at the age of 22 in a drunk driving accident. That has stayed with me far more than what had happened when we were little. But sometimes it was good to reminisce on the good times of playing in there. We spent a lot of time in those swamps, at least before that happened. And once that event occurred, it was the catalyst for us to not really play in those swamps anymore and begin to find other activities around the house and slightly outside, but not in the swamps anymore. It's weird to look at it and think of all the things to be fearful of in the swamps. For whatever reason, we were invincible, or so we thought. We didn't fear alligators or any other poisonous, dangerous animals that inhabit the swamps. But whatever this was, this unknown animal, that was what scared us the most. Back in the late 90s, a lady was said to have committed suicide on a portion of highway that borders a swamp-like area, crashing into an oncoming car. I don't know if her suicide has anything to do with my sighting, but the fact that the two coincide together just makes my skin crawl. In place of her death, or the part of her road that she shot off and died, is a memorial. You know, one of those typical sides of the road white crosses adorned in flowers and other memorial-based items. Well, because of my work, I have to drive this 2-lane highway every day, to and from. I've been very fortunate in these times of COVID-19 that my work has actually been steady. In fact, my workload has actually doubled, if not tripled, and so because of that, I've been very fortunate in these times of COVID-19 that my work has actually doubled, if not tripled, because of other people being laid off, and me being kept on. I want to keep what I do anonymous, so I'll leave it at that. But I'll just say that I help businesses create revenue and bring in more clients. Anyway, I was coming back in the evening time. Keep in mind that because it's spring and summer, it doesn't get dark out till super late. So at this point, the sun was just starting to go down, but it was still bright outside. I'm coming up the hill, getting ready to turn, and the lady's memorial is right there on the side of the road. Well, as I'm coming up, my headlights, which by the way I keep on 24/7 because I prefer to practice good driving, they reflected these two lights to the side of the road, directly to my right where the memorial is. Because the reflection of light caught my eye, out of reaction, I look over and I see this lizard-looking thing on 2 legs that's looking right at me and my car. What exactly was I looking at? I'm not sure. Was I seeing a real-life alien? Was this somebody in a convincing costume that didn't get the memo that it was not yet Halloween? It had a look on its face like, oh crap, I've been spotted. And I went from doing 45 miles an hour to a slow 15, mouth agape and all. I didn't expect to see whatever this was. It looked to maybe be 4 to 5 feet tall, with a long tail that drug behind it. I thought it was a person in a costume again, but it looked to be just like a lizard man, a real-life lizard man. It was really ugly too. After staring at me for a couple of seconds, as I'm passing, it turns around and jumps right back into the trees where it came from. The longer I spent looking at it, the more I came to the conclusion, more and more, that this was a real animal. If it was a costume, by any stretch of the means, then it was a Hollywood tier makeup and acting job. Why would anybody be out here on the side of the highway dressed up like that? I know people do crazy stuff, especially in this day and age with YouTube and everybody wanting views and fame, but it just seemed to be too far-fetched for me, and this thing looked far too animalistic to be a person. I didn't want to believe that, of course. I wanted to believe it was actually a person. I saw what I saw, and I cannot argue with myself and say that this did not look animalistic. Even the look in its eye had that wild animal look. So, afterwards, I called up my wife immediately and told her what I saw. Because, well, her and I tell each other everything, no matter how crazy. I told her that I was worried, and that I wasn't getting enough sleep, and that I was starting to have visions. What I saw didn't look like a vision though. It looked like a real flesh and blood, living being. It looked intelligent, and it looked very much kind of like a human does. The stature, the way it carried itself when it walked, everything. It's kept me up at night, that's for sure. And the next few days and evenings, when I would drive past that memorial spot, I kept looking for this thing, to see if I could see what I saw. I never did see it again, and I have no idea what it was that I did see. I'm not even sure how to wrap my mind around it, because it is just so left field for me. It didn't look like a monster, but maybe a lizard that was exposed to radioactivity, that became part human or mutant or something. I know I'm venturing into the realm of comic book reality here, but the thought of it is just so out of the realm of normal. I can't even come up with words to accurately put a picture of what I saw. It was a human reptile that walked just like a man and acted like a man. I find the term lizard man to be the best way to accurately describe this thing. In my earlier 20s, I was an outdoor junkie. I traveled all over the northern United States and even many parts in Canada to see as much as I could. My whole ideology is that life is so short, I don't want to miss what this beautiful earth has to offer me. I had just gotten out of a very toxic relationship for 4 years with a girl that I probably should have never dated. And to put it lightly, the breakup devastated me. So, I wanted to turn my life around and give my time and energy towards being out in nature. That's what really sparked this whole incident. Had none of that ever happened, I wouldn't have had my sightings as I did, and I certainly wouldn't have been at the Algonquin Provincial Park that day. To make a long story short, I sold everything I had, pretty much lived for hitchhiking and walking everywhere I went. It sounds crazy, but emotional turmoil will make you do crazy things, and I wanted to remedy my pain with nature instead of substances and alcohol and things that would make me feel empty. Anyway, enough talk of broken hearts and trying to heal. Let's get on to what happened. I had a sighting of a reptilian-like creature at Algonquin Park in Ontario 5 years ago. I was hiking by myself, and I came to the end of one of this trail. To the right, the trail curves, but there's a sudden drop-off. If you were to fall, it's about a 50 to 60 foot drop. As I'm approaching this drop-off, and before I can even see down, I hear commotion, like something big moving around. At first, I get excited because I think maybe I'm about to see a large bear or something. But I look down, and I see this large reptilian thing running on all fours off into the woods. I had to double take because in my head, I'm thinking, what am I seeing? I wasn't high, I was not drunk, and I certainly was not on acid. I was sober as a honeybee. I was also the only one around because I did a lot of hikes by myself. I looked around to see if there's anybody else around me that I could motion to ask, did you see that too? Unfortunately, I was the only person around me. I stood there, looking out over the small drop-off into the canyon below, if you could even call it a canyon. About a few minutes later, an older man comes walking up the trail and smiles at me and greets me with a friendly hello. I turn to respond to him, but ask him if he's ever seen anything weird up here. He politely says no, and you could tell by the look on his face that he isn't quite sure what I was getting at. I pointed down at the drop-off and said I just saw this weird reptile creature running on all fours like an animal down there, and I wanted to know if you have ever seen such a thing. He shook his head and continued on with his hike. Now, I was struggling with reality. Did I really see that? Well, I let it go in the moment, and I continued on with my hike. Fast forward years later, and I'm telling my friend about it because we got on the topic of seeing strange animals, and he was telling me about his Bigfoot sighting that he had had. I don't believe in Bigfoot, or really anything that challenges the realm of reality that we live in, but I can't refute my experience, and so I was telling him about what happened to me. He told me that I should go check out this YouTube channel called What Lurks Beneath, and that I should submit my story to you. Well, I checked out your channel, and I was blown away to find that you had a series, an entire series at that, dedicated to just reptilian cryptid creatures. I learned so much in just spending a few hours listening to these encounters back to back. Crocodilian men, Komodo dragon-like people, very similar to what some of the creatures that I saw. I guess I'm not crazy after all, and I'm obviously not the only person seeing these types of creatures. Unlike a lot of the encounters you feature on your episodes, mine didn't happen anywhere close to a swamp, to my knowledge, but it did happen out in the open. Then, my story gets even weirder. Before I actually wrote up my story and sent it to you, I learned about these large mounds that apparently reptilians are drawn to, and I didn't even know if they lived underground or not, or if they lived in these mounds, but they seem to be in all these reptilian stories. Well, I reached out to a couple of my friends who have frequently hiked in the Algonquin Provincial Park. I don't know why I didn't think to do this initially when I had my sighting. I reached out to them and asked if they had ever found anything weird in their journey traversing to the park and hiking. This is where my jaw hit the floor. One friend of mine was telling me, which by the way he's a very experienced outdoorsman, but doesn't know anything about cryptids or certainly reptilians. He discovered what he found were really large mounds, about 9 feet tall, just roughly 6.5 miles off trail. I couldn't believe what he was telling me. This was after I listened to several of your reptilian episodes, and I immediately put the two together. I can't believe what I had heard. I had to sit down and process everything all these years later to realize that this was reality, and I actually saw a reptilian being. I never would have thought in a million years they existed, let alone resided in the Algonquin Provincial Park.